Good, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Waterstone Election 2020 podcast. I'm your host, editor of the Daily Blog, Martyn Bradbury, and with me in the studio is libertarian political commentator and stuff columnist Damien Grant, and our special guest this week is leader of the ACT Party and the only white male told he could keep the cultural appropriation after everyone saw him twerk, David Seymour. Well, we are now 60 days away until the 2020 election after the Prime Minister pushed the election date out to October 17th in a response to a new outbreak of the COVID-19 virus, meaning the entire election is shaped by the COVID management. Damien, our podcast ended last week with you declaring it will be a dull week in the campaign. 30 minutes after we filmed our podcast, the country was plunged back into level 3 after an outbreak in Auckland. Does this highlight the impossible job of trying to call this election?
I think it demonstrates that I am solely here for my good looks and not for my commentary, because clearly my commentary is terrible.
David, let's get into Labour this week. Jacinda was under pressure by National ACT in New Zealand First that the September 19th date was unfair because it would rob them of news oxygen. Jacinda has put the country's needs for a fair election over her own party's drive to win, hasn't she?
Well, I think we could have kept it at September 19th.
Yep.
If only the lockdown was going to lift this Friday, because ACT said we need 4 straight weeks at level 1.
Yes.
Where people can get out and hear from voters as candidates and speak to candidates as voters. That's what really matters.
Yep.
But of course, the real reason it's being delayed is that this government had 102 days of COVID freedom to, mend the ship and cork the holes, and they basically spent the whole time doing victory laps saying, aren't we lucky we're not Victoria, instead of comparing ourselves with the other 8 states and territories doing well. And due to that disposition, we weren't ready for this, and a tiny outbreak requires a 2-week lockdown.
Do you give to Jacinda, though, that she has actually acted in the country's best interest and not Labour's?
Well, I mean, you think about it this way. Had she decided to press ahead, she would have basically been the Prime Minister that decided to have an election while locking down the country before some parties had even had a chance to launch their campaign. And you think about that sort of narrative, how that looks for brand New Zealand.
Yep.
Do you think, David, if Winston Peters hadn't thrown his toys out of the pram and essentially risked precipitating a constitutional crisis, would the Prime Minister have stuck to that September 19 date?
Look, if there's one fact above all that probably no politician would admit influenced the outcome, it was the polling that occurred. The Herald came out with a poll that morning saying that only 40% of people wanted it to stay the same.
Yep.
Only 34% of people in Auckland. I'm aware of polling by the Nats that night, which found that only 27% of Auckland wanted it to stay the same.
Okay.
No doubt Labour had their own poll too. So I think that's what tipped it. Even Labour supporters wanted the election to be delayed.
Damien, we've seen loopholes in the quarantine process, but if you drill down each of those breaches, the issue is the mandatory testing of workers. Will the electorate turn on Labour for not forcing medical procedures on individuals? That's the issue.
Yes, I think they will, because this government's claim to fame, their whole reason for existence at this point is maintaining the quarantine.
Yep.
And whether it's fair or not,
yep.
And I'm not too sure that it is fair. I actually have some sympathy for the government's position here. I think that Labour is going to suffer some fall in support. Not enough, I think, to cost them the election, but it's going to definitely hurt them.
David, while Jacinda led, the National Party spent last week spinning conspiracy theories and then backing away from those conspiracy theories. How dangerous has misinformation and conspiracy theories become in this election?
I don't know. I'm always wary of saying that there was a golden age and things are worse now.
Yep.
For
That's
most
true.
of human history, people believed in the craziest theories.
Yep.
You just have to have a look at the Nordic gods that the Vikings used to have. So, there's definitely people that believe crazy things. I don't know if there are more of them or we've become less recent. I suspect that people that believe crazy things all have a megaphone that you can sign up to just with your email address and a password. And as a result of that, we actually find out a lot more of what a tiny minority of people think that we otherwise wouldn't have even been aware of. And, you got all of these people now following this new party, and it's really tragic because I actually admired Billy T.K. Jr. as a bluesman.
Yes.
Because I love the blues.
Yes.
And it was only today that I realised that the guy leading that party is the same guy who plays the blues.
How dangerous do you think it is, though, David, when you've got people who honestly, hand on heart, believe that the COVID virus is a bioengineered weapon being spread by 5G technology to bring about a shadowy one world government through the UN? I mean, I don't know how many crazy things I can point to in that one sentence, but doesn't that show a terrible... Something's gone wrong with our public education system, surely.
Well, I mean, there's many thoughts. I mean, I am fascinated by this topic. First of all, I don't think that level of craziness is as widely spread as some people make out. I think it's amplified by digital media. Second, but having said that, I mean, we're recording this after the weekend that this story was doing the rounds.
Right.
The woman that's stuck into the isolation facility. And what strikes me is that it was a story in which the villain was a young brown woman, and a story with sex in it, and people just lapped it up, and people were messaging me saying, I believe this is true, why don't you believe it's true? And I said, well, I don't believe it's true because it's much more likely someone's made up a great story than the entire apparatus of New Zealand government and the media are all conspiring to cover something up. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible. I just think you have to ask the question: which of those two stories is more likely?
But then you have the Prime Minister. You have the Prime Minister turning around and saying, "I think she kind of misspoke, really." But when she says, "We, the government, in our press release, we are going to be your only source of truth." I mean, I think that was taken a little bit out of context, and people are kind of conspiracizing it. But I mean, but I think part of the problem is
I didn't even hear that, to be honest. What is worrying is that the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister has been participating in this in the foreign...
Oh, I know. We'll get into that in a minute. Hold on, Damien. Judith claims she needs more media time, but every time the media focus on her, the voters recoil in horror. Wouldn't National get a higher vote if no one saw Judith for the next 60 days? Every poll she's gone backwards in since she took over as leader. The more they see of her, the more they go, oh, sweet God, no.
Do you think we should start coup rumours that are circling a National Party to replace Judith?
No one would believe it because it's just such an absolutely appalling... Did you see in politics today that National Party backers and supporters aren't paying up as much money? The actual backers now aren't putting their money where their mouth is. Donations are down. People are walking away from National in droves, aren't they? And they're apparently all going to David.
Yeah, but I'm not so convinced that there is necessarily a huge connection between money and votes. I think what Judith is saying is correct. If she gets media attention, then presuming that media attention actually reflects well on her, then I think that becomes self-reinforcing. And we've seen ACT go up in the polls.
Yes.
We've seen New Zealand First go down in the polls.
Yes.
I'm not too sure that either of those two phenomena are necessarily a function of the amount of money that they are getting. I think the performance of the various parties is what's driving it. So the fact that National may be getting this money, if Judith came out there and performed really well, and frankly the way David has been doing in the speech he gave in Parliament today, if Judith were able to articulate some of that stuff, I think that National would start to gain traction.
Let's talk Greens. Yeah. David, can Chloe Swarbrick...
Just add one thing about that.
Yeah, go for it.
we're literally polling 10 times higher in this election than the last one.
Yes.
And we're probably having a marginally harder time raising money. And that's because, there's an economic crisis out there and enormous uncertainty. So if the Nats are having trouble, I'd be amazed if the Nats weren't having trouble fundraising. I think everyone is. And I think the Greens will be absolutely crapping themselves at the extension of this election.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right.
That's an interesting point. This 4-week extension is going to increase the financial burdens.
Oh, yeah. Damien, let's talk about the Greens with Jacinda once again shining and taking all the news oxygen. They're screwed, aren't they? Why would you vote? Why would you vote Green when Jacinda is just sucking up all that news oxygen, doing her thing?
I don't know. I actually think that the government's missed it over the COVID thing. Might actually give the Greens a little bit of oxygen. If some of the tarnish comes off Labor, then some of those left-wing support, and it doesn't need to be much. 30,000, 40,000 votes is all it may potentially need to get.
But do they have the
Greens.
money to be able to do it another month's worth of campaigning?
But that's what David was just saying. The money doesn't necessarily matter at the margins. If the Greens are able to do well, we get closer to the election. The focus on Chloe Swarbrick and Auckland Central, the Greens are going to get a lot of free publicity.
David, can Chloe Swarbrick win Auckland Central? I mean, did the move fiasco hurt National's chances there?
Not a chance. Look, first of all, let me say I have a huge personal regard for Chloe, and I think we have a good relationship. But here's what she's up against. Number one, she doesn't have the time.
Yes.
So, to win a seat like ACT as an Epsom actually took 20 years of investment.
Yes.
And I started door knocking in February to win in September.
That's right.
Second of all, there has to be some compatibility. So your average Epsom voter isn't sitting there thinking, "Oh no, not a party that's pro-business and believes in lower taxes." Whereas I can guarantee you that your average Herne Bay, Ponsonby, or Grey Lynn voter will be saying, "Well, I kind of care about the environment, but what's that about putting a 10% capital tax on my house?" There's a problem with compatibility there. So, the candidate may be a good quality candidate, but not enough time and not enough compatibility for her to win.
Has the move fiasco hurt National and Central Auckland?
No, because the average person is far too sensible to even be aware of the move fiasco. That's subject for political tragics and Bowen Triangle aficionados.
Let's talk about New Zealand first. David, did Winston force the PM's hand over the election date change? Your call.
No. I think it was the polling that will have been the main factor. I actually thought she'd keep it at September 19, but when I woke up and saw the Herald poll and heard about the National Party poll, then I knew that it was not going to be held on September 19.
Damien, with more time to panic, 4 more weeks to panic, how far away is New Zealand First from cutting a deal with National and Northland to get Shane Jones in? Could there be a terrible blue wedding moment when New Zealand First turn on Jacinda and cut a deal in Northland with National?
I understand that there was collusion between National and New Zealand First over the election date. And I've heard that from a couple of credible sources.
Yes.
But I just don't think that the damage that would do to National to throw a lifeline to New Zealand First.
They're kind of hemorrhaging right now.
Yeah, but I mean, they're still a long way from 20.93%.
Right.
So I know I don't think they will. Although,
but look, can I just pipe up as someone who has actually won a seat as a third party representative? It's not that easy. So people in Northland aren't just sitting there waiting for someone to tell them what the strategy is. Even if Judith Collins went up there and personally beat every voter, doesn't mean they're going to vote for Shane Jones because the guy's just fundamentally unelectable.
Yeah. So how do you do it in Epsom? Do you get on your belly and crawl? How do you do it?
Well, in my case, you knock on 14,000 doors, introduce yourself and ask for the vote and explain the strategy.
Do you pet the pet when they're there? Like the dog?
Well, I was actually a little bit scared of dogs sometimes.
And that was Simon Bridges. That was Simon Bridges' thing. He always said that the way you win Tauranga is you go to the door, you say hello, you pet their dog, you say how lovely their children are. No one talks policy, and you walk away, and you get their vote.
Or you
pet the dog, say something nice about
turn
the
up
kid.
with a yak.
Let's talk ACT. Let's talk ACT. David, what does it say about the wasteland that is New Zealand politics if the ACT party can outpoll the Greens? Oh the horror.
Well, it may be horrible to you, but there's a whole lot of people who, aspirational and want a bit of critical thinking in Parliament, and actually they're seeing that coming from ACT.
Doesn't that suggest, David, that there has actually been a tectonic shift towards ACT over the last 6 months that we haven't seen in the last 9 years? Why do you think it is that you guys are just soaring in the polls right now?
Well, you look at the timeline, so there's a few hypotheses about this. Some people think it's firearms advocacy and free speech. What's interesting is the polls flatlined for 6 months after March 15. What happened 6 months after March 15, actually 8 months, was a month of saturation, wall-to-wall coverage around end-of-life choice. And people saw a party of one person in Parliament who could do more constructive stuff than the whole government, frankly, because what have they achieved to rival that in their time? And then you've got the COVID response, and suddenly I go from being 1/60th of the opposition to 1/6 on the Epidemic Response Committee.
Yes.
And the feedback that I've had from people is they say, look, we actually like that consistent, constructive, positive approach to how do we get a better country. And I said, well, that's what we've been doing all along. It's just harder to be seen amongst a bigger crowd. So look, and that is the point where the polling rose significantly. It rose a bit after last November.
Yep.
It rose a lot after that COVID period.
Do you think, David, it's happened because the ACT party now represents values, certain values that people hold dear, rather than specific policy? Because people look to you now almost as the actual leader of the opposition, because your criticism in Parliament seems to be devoid of the nastiness that Judith enjoys. But you're much more, look, here's the problem, bang, 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 bang. Do you think it's because people now see ACT as a representative of political values that they support rather than specific policy? Because forgive me, I haven't heard a hell of a lot of people on the right talk about ACT party policy, but they talk about how much they like you and the values that ACT stand for now.
Look, I think it's pretty difficult to get people to talk about policies generally, so
Yep.
there's no shortage of policy we're putting out. You look at our mental health policy, I think that's revolutionary.
I think it's terrible, but we'll discuss that on our which I suppose is good if the hardcore insane libertarian looks at it and says, "What are you doing? We should be scrapping the 1.9 million, not giving vouchers."
Only libertarians bring guns to lifeboats, ladies and gentlemen. Only libertarians bring guns to lifeboats.
But Martyn, what you're saying there, I think is correct. It is a values-driven thing. So if you have a look at the end-of-life choice stuff and you have a look at, and I don't think it was so much the guns necessarily, it was the fact that David was saying, hey, I'm not happy with the process by which that has been driven through.
Right.
And I think most people got lost on the minutiae of the free speech thing, but I think they understood that ACT was pushing something, and most people wouldn't understand what we mean when we say classical liberal values.
Right.
Or traditions, but I think that there is a very clear position that ACT has been doing, and that's quite a contrast where National has been coming from. And I don't necessarily know that the decline in National Party voters has necessarily been linked to ACT. I think ACT has won some of those voters off on its own merits, not necessarily a fall. But David, I'm quite interested. You've staked out a reasonably interesting position here with respect to COVID. So you're coming out there taking a reasonably different position from both National and Labour in terms of our approach to the border. I mean, what was anything driven by that? I mean, what do you want to just talk about that? Because I mean, I find that a really interesting and frankly courageous approach.
Well, we're problem solvers, and what's the problem here is that there's this virus that every country faces, and we each have to work out what our strategy is. So one thing that's the bottom line, I think the electorate and the people are very clear on, is that they want elimination. But if we're going to have elimination, we have to be honest that from a point of view of overall well-being, lockdowns are just unaffordable. I mean, you look at the mental health impacts, you look at the educational impacts, you look at the financial impacts. I mean, 2 weeks of lockdown in Auckland costs about the same as a whole year's pharmaceutical supplies. I mean, that's the farming budget gone for a year, and just 2 weeks in one city. So, from a well-being lens, which the government talks about but doesn't actually do, we actually can't afford to keep doing lockdowns. So then you say, well, what's the answer? And there's only one country that I'm aware of, and that's the great thing about the modern world, is there's 200 countries and we can actually study what works. So there's one country that's actually managed it, and that's Taiwan. And then you say, okay, well, what is it? What is the essence of what they've done? Well, one thing is they have their Central Epidemic Command Centre. They've got one multidisciplinary organisation that coordinates, cuts across public and private sector, and just gets stuff done. The Ministry of Health, by contrast, I mean, you want them to develop software to solve this problem? I mean, these are the people responsible for the state of patient health records.
I'm so glad to hear you calling for a bigger state, David. That's the best. That's the best thing we've heard.
I'm calling for the resources to be better organised. So we're not anarchists. We agree there's going to be a state, but it's got to be better organised. And then you say, okay, well, look, what about risk? I mean, there's no concept of risk in the government's response. We put, a deportee from an Australian gang in the same basic setup, perhaps with a few more security guards, as we put people coming from COVID-free countries, or we put, rail engineers coming to work on the city rail lane.
Yes, but look, those are absolutely valid, David. But you, surely as a politician, know better than most that New Zealanders at the moment are frightened. They feel their sacrifice is on par with the boys charging over the beaches at Gallipoli, that everyone must be sacrosanct with that sacrifice. And the moment people feel that it's somehow gotten back into the country because of incompetence, all hell breaks loose. So, I mean, unless you're going to have quite a hard line in terms of management at the border and testing everyone and all of the issues you just brought up there, if you're caught out as the person who said, oh, well, no, we don't need to do that, you get it. You get it in the neck at 1 p.m. weekdays, don't you?
Yeah, but hang on. The government has made this bed and must lie in it.
Right. Okay.
One is they created and fed the fear when the Prime Minister came out and said, if you don't stay home, tens of thousands will die.
Yes.
When she said stay home, save lives, when she said unite against COVID-19, she created the total lack of dissent or discussion. She created the fear, and she created an environment that is hostile to realism and problem solving. So she's created all that. I agree those are problems, but it's created by the leadership style. What the Prime Minister should have said is this is going to be very tough. We're going to need to problem solve. We won't always get it right, but we are going to lead the world in the end. And then set about pragmatically solving the problem one by one. That's an environment that would have actually put us in a much better position. Instead, we are in the situation you described, but let's just remember it's created by the leadership style.
You see, I think ACT's position there is one step ahead of where public opinion is. And
I think it's 2 steps ahead of where the National Party is.
Yep, but I think public opinion is moving in that direction really hard. I think that the willingness to tolerate lockdowns is very wide but very shallow.
You look at the level of fear we've got with a cluster of, 40 odd, right?
Yes.
Imagine 1,000.
Yeah,
Imagine
but
1,500.
But
People will lose their shit.
no, you have a look in overseas jurisdictions. As I think David, it might have been you who made the point that in France they're just going about their business. You get to a point in a society
Where you just roll over and sign a deal with the Nazis.
Yeah.
I get it. Final
What?
word, David. Dave, that's exactly what the
How
French
did
did.
we get to the
Because that's
Nazis?
exactly what the French did.
I think
They
that's
surrendered to everything.
It's a bit unreasonable.
I just want to say that I think it's unreasonable. Final word, David. Predictions for the week ahead.
Look, I think that the outbreak will dribble out. We will have an early lifting of lockdown after a few days with no cases. They'll lift it earlier than the 26th. The Parliament will rise after next week, and we will have, an election campaign restarted with 7 weeks to the finish line, and it's going to be a great time because New Zealanders are going to have some real choices about whether or not the competence and management of this and strategy of this government in this crisis is really the best we can do, or do we deserve better?
What are your just in case we don't get you before the election? What's your David? And I'm sure Damien will have you on again as soon as he can. But what's your prediction for ACT on October the 17th?
Well, that's up for the voters.
Of course. But would you be happy at 5? Would you be over the moon at 6? Would you be ecstatic at 7?
Look, if we get half a dozen MPs in, that makes us a so-called specified party under the standing orders, and that will allow us to be quite effective. But look, at the end of the day, just growing the ACT team, I think is a really good investment in New Zealand. I think a lot of voters want a group of thoughtful, independent-minded MPs sitting on the cross benches, keeping the left out of power and keeping the right accountable.
Damien, predictions for next week, seeing as last week's prediction was remarkable. What's your call this week?
No, I'm not going to make a prediction.
What?
I think. Well, you don't reward failure. Clearly, last week my predictive ability was a complete failure. So
It's going to be a really quiet week, and then just everything blew up.
Except I will make one prediction.
Yep.
I'll make the news.
That sounds terrifying. Our next election podcast is Tuesday next week. We're going weekly through till the election. Thanks, David.
Hey, thank you guys. Okay, well.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.